Hello lovelies, in this video the brilliant Dr. Edwards is going to be taking you through the control of heart rate. So how the heart knows when to beat, how fast to beat, and all the different signals interact with this.
Control of heart rate. Heart rate is an example of the body using both nervous and hormonal control to coordinate a response. The control of regular heart rate and the fight or flight response, which affects heart rate in stressful conditions, both use the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic system has many nerves coming out from the central nervous system, where the parasympathetic has only a few nerves coming out from the central nervous system. In the sympathetic system, the ganglia are close to the central nervous system, whereas in the parasympathetic system, the ganglia are actually in the affected tissue. So the ganglia are just kind of like the junctions, the relay junctions where nerves connect and synapse onto other nerve fibers. So it's just about where these connections are. So either close to the central nervous system or actually in the affected tissues. They use different neurotransmitter chemicals as well. So the sympathetic system uses noradrenaline as its neurotransmitter at synapses, whereas the parasympathetic system uses acetylcholine. The sympathetic system is normally associated with things that increase activity levels, whereas the parasympathetic is going to be sending signals to decrease activity levels. The sympathetic system is most active when you are stressed or active, and the parasympathetic is most active during sleep or when you're very relaxed. So for example, that we're going to look at, the sympathetic system is going to increase our heart rate, whereas the parasympathetic system is going to decrease our heart rate. Okay, so just a reminder before we go into kind of the details of how heart rate is controlled by the nervous system. A reminder that cardiac muscle is myogenic, so it means it initiates its own contraction. So it initiates its own action potentials and stimulates the muscle to contract. It doesn't need an external stimulus to start the contractions, it will do it anyway. But obviously the rate of contraction can be controlled, and we're controlling it with the autonomic nervous system. So this is not about causing the heart to beat, because it's doing that anyway. Those contractions and action potentials from the sinoatrial node and those spreading out of that signal to the AV node and then the ventricles contracting is happening already, and it's happening automatically. We're just going to be able to control the speed or the rate of those impulses from the SA node, and therefore the impulses from the AV node, and so therefore control the kind of rate of contraction. So let's have a quick reminder about heartbeat, because it would have been a while ago. So the action potential is initiated by the sinoatrial node or the SA node. That's in the wall of the right atrium. It's known as the pacemaker or the bunch of pacemaker cells. Obviously, if this stops working at any point, then you can have an artificial pacemaker fitted, which will control the rhythm of the heartbeat, because obviously this is about it beating automatically but also beating in a steady rhythm. And some people who have arrhythmia, so not regular rhythmic heartbeat, need the artificial pacemaker to do the job of the sinoatrial node. Then that action potential causes an impulse to travel through the walls of the atria, and you can see it obviously goes across to both atria, and then it hits the AV node. So that impulse, so that action potential spreads through and causes that muscle contraction for the atria, but then also hits the AV node. And then that AV node is then an action potential is triggered there, and that wave of electrical activity travels down the Purkinje fibres. They're spelt in different ways, but that's how we say it. Travels down the fibres in the bundle of His, so that kind of bundle of nerves through the septum that then branches off and goes up and around the sides of the ventricle walls. The signal travels down there, and then that causes that muscle around the ventricle wall muscle to contract. And it contracts from the apex upwards, squeezing the ventricles, and then that obviously pushes blood out of the aorta and the pulmonary artery. So that's how heartbeat is controlled. It's about action potentials being triggered in the sinoatrial node that then kind of hit the AV node, and then that travel down the Purkinje fibres in the middle of the heart in the septum, and then travel up through the ventricle walls and cause muscle contraction. So we're really talking about controlling the frequency of impulses or the frequency of action potentials that are happening at the sinoatrial node. That's what the autonomic nervous system is going to control here. And then the rest of this process happens exactly as we've just said. Regardless of how frequent those impulses are, heartbeat will still happen in the same way. Okay, so we're going to look at two examples of receptors that detect changes in the body that cause the heart to change. So baroreceptors are detecting changes in blood pressure. They're actually detecting the stretch in the walls of blood vessels. Then you've got chemoreceptors, and they're detecting levels of oxygen or changes in blood pH due to carbon dioxide forming carbonic acid in blood plasma. Both types of these are found in the aorta and the carotid sinus, which is just a way of saying it's a specific part of the wall of the carotid artery, which is in your neck. So, like we said, these are receptors, and they're going to detect changes, either the chemical changes or the pressure of the blood, which will cause these blood vessels to stretch more, and that stretch in that muscle is what's detected by the baroreceptors. So both of these types of receptors can send electrical impulses along autonomic nerves to change the heart rate. They're both connected by autonomic nerves to the cardiovascular centre in the medulla oblongata, which is found in the brainstem. So this is obviously a region in the brainstem that is responsible for controlling heart rate or cardiovascular rates. If you remember, we talked briefly about coordination when we talked about the central nervous system and the spinal cord. So this is part of the brain that's coordinating the response from the sensory receptors. So we've got sensory receptors that are the baroreceptors or the chemoreceptors. They are sending the information that they're detecting from the stimulus to the medulla oblongata, and that's then going to coordinate the response. So that's going to decide what to do about this change in stimulus and then cause an effect. So it's going to send more signals down more nerves to cause the change that we want to see. So in this case, the medulla oblongata is able to send impulses to the sinoatrial node, directly to the sinoatrial node in the heart. And there's two types of nerves that it's going to use, depending on whether it's going to increase or decrease the heart rate. So if it uses the vagus nerve, which is a parasympathetic nerve branch, it's going to decrease the heart rate. And then if it uses a sympathetic nerve, in this case it's called the accelerans nerve, we don't need to know that for now, but the sympathetic nerve, that's going to increase heart rate. And this is because they both use different neurotransmitters. So the vagus nerve is going to use an inhibitory neurotransmitter, whereas the sympathetic nerve is going to use an excitatory neurotransmitter. We'll cover that in more detail when we look at synapses and the junction between nerves. But for now, we just need to know that we're using sympathetic for speeding up heart rate and vagus or parasympathetic branch for slowing it down. So let's look at how the heart rate is changed in order to maintain blood pressure. So the stimulus in each case will be stretch receptors, which detect either high or low blood pressure. And remember, these are in the carotid sinus or the carotid artery. So the baroreceptors in the aorta walls or the carotid artery walls are going to detect this stretch if there is a high blood pressure. They're going to then send impulses along a sensory input to the medulla oblongata and tell it we need to reduce the heart rate. So this is then detected by the medulla oblongata, and that's going to use parasympathetic nerves to send impulses that release noradrenaline at the sinoatrial node in the right atrium. The SA node will then decrease the frequency of impulses to the AVN to decrease the heart rate. So we've got to remember here that we're talking about a decrease in frequency. Those are the key words. You can't just say less, like it doesn't contract as much, or it's about the frequency. So it's less frequent impulses to the AVN, and that helps to decrease the heart rate. So for a low blood pressure, we are going to detect it in the same way. So the baroreceptors in the aorta or the carotid sinus walls will detect that kind of recoil in terms of stretch when the blood pressure drops. The impulse will be sent to the medulla oblongata in order to increase the heart rate in the same way. So there'll be sensory input. And then this time we're going to use a sympathetic nerve. So the medulla uses sympathetic nerves to send impulses and release noradrenaline at the sinoatrial node in the right atrium. The sinoatrial node will then increase the frequency of impulses to the AVN node to increase the heart rate. So again, we're talking about increasing the frequency of impulses. And the idea behind all of this is that it prevents fainting. So you don't want your blood pressure to ever drop too low because that risks blood not getting to the brain. And then if that happens, then your body's response is to pass out or faint so that we can kind of reserve oxygen for the brain. Okay, now let's have a look at how heart rate changes can react to changes to blood oxygen or pH. So most of the time this is going to happen when you've got exercise occurring because you've got increased rates of respiration, which means we need more oxygen going to our muscles and we've got more carbon dioxide being produced that needs to be removed. So it could be building up and causing that carbonic acid to increase, which will lower the pH. Or obviously we've got low oxygen levels because a lot of it's being used up. So if that is detected by these chemoreceptors, then we're going to send impulses again to the medulla oblongata to increase the heart rate. But we'll explain why that makes sense in a second. The medulla is going to use the sympathetic nerve to send impulses and release noradrenaline at the sinoatrial node in the right atrium again. And again, we're saying, so the sinoatrial node is going to increase the frequency of impulses that are sent to the AVN, and therefore we increase heart rate. So that's the kind of how it happens. That's the description of how heart rate changes in response to low oxygen or response to exercise, for example. But the why would be a separate point. So this is just what happens, not why. The why do we need to increase heart rate? Well, it should make sense because if we increase heart rate, we increase blood flow to the lungs, which means blood oxygen levels can increase, but also it helps to remove the excess carbon dioxide. So it's just the same reason as asking at GCSE, for example, why would heart rate increase during exercise? This is why, and this is the answer you would give, because increased levels of respiration are required, so more oxygen is needed, and more lactic acid and more carbon dioxide are building up, so we need to get rid of them. It's the same answer, that's the why. We've just got a bit more of a description now about understanding how it actually happens and how it's triggered by the nervous system. Okay, that is how heart rate is controlled. As I said, remember there is obviously the impact of hormones, but that's not covered in this video because we're just looking at the nervous system and receptors here. There are some other receptors like stretch receptors, which can also be used, and we've talked about stretch receptors in the blood vessels, but they can also be in the muscles as well. And it works in exactly the same way. Stretching your muscles triggers your heart rate to increase in anticipation of exercise, which is another interesting point. But this is how heart rate is controlled. It's obviously linked to an AS topic, which is obviously heart rate and how that's initiated, and the cardiac cycle. So it could be a synoptic question. So it's worth revising both when you go through this topic. And this is sort of one of the more complex nervous feedback mechanisms that we have to learn. But hopefully that was helpful. So we said that heart rate was affected by both nervous control, which we've just looked at, but can also be affected by hormonal control. And we've mentioned the fight or flight response already when we talked about adrenaline. So the fight or flight response is a response to danger or threat, and it's also controlled by the hypothalamus, and it uses both the hormonal and the nervous control systems. So it's going to be sensory receptors in your body that are going to detect a threat, such as pain or a sudden drop in blood pressure. Could be lots of different things that could cause you to perceive that there might be danger. And we know that sometimes our body has and goes into this fight or flight response, which is evolutionary leftover from when we had to run and fight big prey or big predator items potentially. But now it sometimes gets triggered for things like anxiety, stress, going on a roller coaster, sitting an exam, standing up in front of people and talking. So it's not just always a response to threat or danger. So the first thing that happens is you're going to have some kind of sensory input into the cerebrum, and that's going to then stimulate the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to do two things. It's going to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, and then it's also going to release a couple of hormones, so CRH and THR, and these are going to cause the anterior pituitary glands to secrete ACTH and TSH, two other hormones. So the activation of the sympathetic nervous system is going to activate the adrenal medulla, and that's going to cause it to secrete adrenaline into the bloodstream. So we're using a nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, to affect a gland, which is going to then secrete a hormone, which is going to have effects on the body that are going to be important for this fight or flight response. And one of them is an increase in heart rate. So adrenaline traveling around in the blood is going to bind, and through the secondary messenger model that we looked at, it will bind to heart muscle cells, and this is then how that increase in heart rate will occur. So we just need to know that as well as the systems we've just looked at, the nervous control system for heart rate, we also can affect it through hormonal control using adrenaline. So the rest of the fight or flight response comes from these anterior pituitary hormones. So ACTH causes the adrenal cortex to secrete steroid hormones, including cortisol. So we said this was obviously linked to the stress response, and that involves helping us increase the amount of glucose we have in the blood. And then TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, you may have covered this at GCSE, but that helps us to increase the metabolic rate of cells. So it basically speeds up all of the chemical reactions in the body. So we've got an increase in heart rate, which is also to obviously help transport and increase blood flow around the body. We've got an increase in the breakdown of glycogen, but also the production of glucose from other molecules happening, which means we've got more glucose available for respiration. And then we have an increase in metabolic rate, which speeds up all those chemical reactions, including respiration. So it just means that the body's extra prepared for whatever's going to happen. We've got lots of oxygen, we've got lots of glucose, it's traveling around the body. We've got all of those heightened sensory perception things as well going on that we talked about with adrenaline, and it just prepares your body for any activity. Investigating heart rate. There are different factors that you can measure in this investigation that could affect your heart rate, such as exercise, loud noises or being scared, or anxiety. To take measurements, you can either manually measure the pulse rate by counting beats per minute or beats within 15 seconds and then multiply by 4 using 2 fingers on a pulse point, or you can use an electric heart rate monitor, which often is worn on the chest, and it can measure continuously throughout the experiment, and then you can record changes. The method. You need to start with a baseline of resting heart rate. So you need to measure your heart rate at rest and record this. Then you do some exercise for a set amount of time, or you experience a loud noise, or do something that makes you anxious or nervous. Then you need to measure your heart rate immediately after finishing that exercise or activity. Then you need to sit down and rest as you did at the start, and measure your heart rate every minute until you get back to that resting heart rate point. You should also time how long it takes to get back down to resting heart rate. This can be repeated to calculate a mean on the same person if it's exercise, but not for the other factors, because they will be expecting it and therefore the response won't be the same. Or you could repeat it with different people, and then you can compare using a statistical test. If you're comparing two means, then you would use a t-test.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I'll explain scratches.